Welcome to episode 38 of the Creative Train podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about some interesting ways to link your lesson materials to other things your students might already know and understand, like sports and cooking or other habits and hobbies. How using things like metaphor or drawing parallels between methods and materials can help gain and maintain your students' interest and curiosity. It also makes your lessons or learning points that you want to get across better understood by making sure that you're using more common language and imagery instead of that Charlie Brown wah 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 teacher speak. Ugh. All aboard? You may have noticed that the last two episodes have been out of order. This is 38 and the one previous was 39, but it had to do with the previous episode being a little more time sensitive, so I had it already recorded and I released it ahead of time. So down to the business here. I'm pretty sure that if you've been in the business of teaching or educating for some time, you've found yourself running off an internal script of sorts when talking to your students. And part of this is talking about something you've come to understand or appreciate and do, like I say, by doing the thing. Part of the way you talk to your students is drawn from how you understand those things, meaning how you internalize or process information becomes part of how you describe those lessons learned. If you are fairly new to the field of teaching anything, whether it be the arts or sciences or technology or trades, you've obviously paid your dues to be able to have the credentials to teach. Maybe you haven't developed or found your flow when talking to students in an effective and genuine manner. And you'll know when your students are checking out on you. Case in point, though, I had a teacher, we'll call him that, when I was in college, who, although he was a really dynamic fellow outside of the classroom and a fantastic musician, his teaching methods were a total snooze fest, and it became pretty clear he was very new to teaching. In fact, we were his first ever teaching gig. And this was a class on music technology. And back in the 90s, there was early 90s, there was a huge shift in music recording technology away from the traditional tape recording method to that of digital or computer-based technology. As with all new things, in retrospect, it was pretty cumbersome and awkward and didn't really allow much of an intuitive approach to the beginner, as the learning curve was really pretty steep. So, being fairly new to the tech side of things, our teacher was essentially learning from our textbook on the topic to be delivering his next lesson on the following day. Not only was he inexperienced as a teacher, he was woefully unprepared and just barely engaging due to his apparent lack of comfort with being in front of a classroom when part of him knew that he was just barely one step ahead of the class, and for those of us who chose to read ahead, we could ask him questions on things that were coming up, and he said pretty much that he wasn't prepared to talk about those things yet. And you can't fault someone for being new. Everyone is new to something at some point. But in this particular situation, the teacher himself only barely understood the lesson material, and it showed, but he had the credentials to teach. See the connection? He couldn't make his lessons come across as learning moments. And it all sounded like that Charlie Brown teacher I mentioned earlier. Wah, 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 wah. I've come across this many, many times in my main field, which is music education, where the new hotshot comes out of university or college with a diploma and big dreams and gets hired to teach both the new and the experienced students. In those moments, the new teacher will usually resort to trying to teach in one of the ways that they were first taught, whether they liked it or not, because it's the only thing they know. Their script sounds a lot like their first few teachers' scripts, and it always comes across as sometimes more than kind of phony or disingenuous. And maybe it's because their vibe is not one of speaking from a position of experience and confidence, but instead of almost panic and definitely a lack of focus and direction. And the weirdest part is that so many music schools will fight and clamor for these new hires because they hold that diploma, that piece of paper saying that they can teach. In my industry, there is really a pretty quick turnover in most institutions for a few reasons. Burnout is a major factor because once your passion becomes your job, it's often really challenging to stay inspired. Also, these new hires will usually branch out to opening their own teaching studios once they get a feel for the process. Not of just teaching, but of running a business. And they don't usually do very well. So music lesson studios are usually in some sort of transition phase with their teachers. Some are on their way in, some are on their way out. Here in Canada, one of the major music stores always has positions advertised for teaching jobs. Their main requirement is that every teacher or applicant must have at least a grade 8 Royal Conservatory of Music degree, and preferred that they also have their teaching certificate from that same organization. It's not experienced teachers they want to hire. It's those with the certificate. For a lark, I applied to one of those positions a few years ago and was denied the position despite having almost 25 years of experience at that point. And I had a chance to talk to the HR person on the phone. I requested a phone call to follow up. And I asked how many of their students are studying the Royal Conservatory methods. They said they had none and never really do. And I asked why their priority is for the teacher to hold such a lofty certificate if pretty much 100% of the students were not interested in learning classical music. They told me it proves the teacher's skill and ability and understanding of the instrument. So for those who don't know, a lot of people that are super trained in reading music have a really hard time not reading music to play. Either they learn the music and memorize it or read it as they go. And a lot of the time I found that those folks really struggle with trying to figure out melody patterns and chord patterns just by ear. And that is something that as a music teacher, contemporary music teacher, in basically any facility, you have to be ready and willing to do on the spot because you're being paid by the minute to do so. This really drives the point home that just because you can do something does not mean that you can teach that same thing effectively. There's this weird anecdotal saying, let me know what you think of this. It says that those who cannot do, teach, and those that cannot teach, write about it. And here I am making a podcast about it. So where does that leave me? These last two scenarios were all to make the point that you may understand a piece of technology or a process or a method, but unless your approach to teaching is tempered and honed and learned by doing the thing, you will never be able to maintain your students' attention and focus until you've learned how to draw interesting parallels, creative metaphors, by genuinely engaging with your students and getting to understand how they learn. A teacher is not someone who just merely recites facts from a book. Do you need such things as metaphor or analogous comparisons to get your lesson materials across? Well, technically, no, but it goes a long, long way to helping your students process the information to be able to connect with you, for you to be able to connect with them outside of the lecturer or the sermon giver. Being able to show and demonstrate connections where others might not see or even think about them is a pretty great tool to have in your teacher's toolbox. The inspiration from this episode was from one of my private lessons last week. The kid's mom usually sits in on the lessons, farting around on her phone for an hour. Sometimes she will chime in with a comment or something, but usually not. But she did make it very well known to me that she studied the Royal Conservatory for 10 years in her youth, which kind of felt like a shot across the bow to me that she's going to be measuring my teaching ability to that of her former teachers. I was kind of running off one of my own scripts with the student when I was describing to her how her listening habits will start to change now that she's studying music. And I always say to every student, even if it's their first day, that your listening habits and your appreciation and understanding of music is going to change now that you are a musician. I let them know that I look at them as a musician, not just a student. And I think that usually does something for their confidence. They usually smile a bit when I say something like that. So this analog that I like to use is that of a chef going into a restaurant for a meal. The chef simply cannot sit down and eat and not consider the use of any of the ingredients, the preparation, the presentation, and the overall flavor profile of the dish or the vibe of the restaurant. It just won't happen. They can't suddenly stop being a chef and disengage their palate to go through the motions of eating simply because they were hungry. I've used this example hundreds, maybe 1,000 times over the years. And it usually seems to make sense to the students as they start to notice their listening skills evolving. I'll always come back to that point a month or two into their lessons if I can see that they're starting to get it, because they may have forgotten we even talked about it. So this mom looked up from her phone with a curious look on her face and said something to the effect of, I never thought of it that way. So I asked her if listening skills were ever part of her musical education, and she said they were absolutely not. There was practical and there was theory, and the only other discussion around music was regarding performances, recitals, things like tempo, dynamics, and overall technique. Never was she spoken to as a person who just loves to play music. Now, to be fair, this isn't how all classical music education systems work. Many make great use of listening skills with things like chord and scale identification, interval training, but that one moment when the student's mom had a new understanding of music as a creative art form and not just something to be studied from a book was a pretty awesome feeling for me. It was one of the only times I've actually ever seen her smile and look up from her phone. And I know I've touched on this topic a few times in other episodes, but I felt it to be a good time to revisit it, since I believe it's super important for teachers to be able to keep things fresh and engaging. Now, I can't use these internal scripts over and over with the same student because they'll eventually become tired of hearing them. And it seems if the message was not really assimilated the time or two, I got to find another way so I don't end up sounding like the Charlie Brown teacher. So I always try to keep things fresh and engaging by asking about the students' other activities like sports or video games or any other creative pursuits. And by doing this, I can make up new scenarios or examples, even metaphors, to keep my message on track with the student's mind and hands engaged. I have had the real pleasure of working mostly one-on-one with my music students. But if you're in front of a class of 20 or even 200, the one thing you have to do is remember why those people are there. They're all vastly different people with vastly different backgrounds, experiences, and learning habits. But the one thing they all have in common is that you are their teacher. And it's incredibly important that you remember the best and worst moments of your own learning journey. Allow those to shape your own teaching methods. Use those examples of effective and ineffective teaching methods to your advantage and really meditate on them, and allow yourself to create new methods that, although they may be different from how you were taught, they might also be the ways that you've always wished your lessons or sessions could have been conducted. Don't be the Charlie Brown teacher. It takes a certain level of bravery, but mostly confidence, to find yourself creating new ways and methods in the shadows of traditional ways and methods. And even someone who is totally new to being in the position of a teacher or an educator can do this. But they have to always keep the ideal in mind that their teaching method should be primarily shaped by the way they wish they were taught. There is a lot to be said for traditional teaching methods and traditional materials and means, but if you can't show your students that you're trying to engage with them, you'll just end up being that Charlie Brown teacher. Your lessons will be treated like a sermon, and half the class will check out as soon as they hear that monotone in your voice. Always, in every learning situation, a certain level of playful curiosity is needed, whether someone realizes it or not. Even a few moments of comic relief, or a what if, or what's the worst that could happen scenario type situation comes up. It's your job as the teacher, the educator, the delivery person of information and inspiration to indulge those moments, show your students the minimums and the extremes, and then the way to finally understand the process and the materials down the middle with balance and understanding. And allow your students to have fun imagining these things rather than just writing down, memorizing facts, whatever, from your sermon. If you're in a one-on-one situation or a classroom situation and notice your lesson or lecture is starting to go off the rails and students are visibly checking out or distracted, ask yourself, what would I, as a student, want to have happen now? And other than going home or going out to the bathroom and coming back 20 minutes later, you know you have to stay. But what would change your focus back to the person at the front of the class? Is it a change of topic, a change of pace, a chance to have open discussion, a funny example of the lesson point? If you think about it quickly, you'll figure out what it is. And when you do figure out what it is, change the flow immediately. Sameness dulls the mind. It's like a song with only one note, or no groove, or a meal with little to no seasoning, and the same texture. That sameness or lack of a dynamic difference will not only lead to your students checking out mentally, it drives them to the point of checking out. It's something to really think about, this how you wish you were taught. If you're a teacher now, you can totally make that happen, and you might just have the time of your life doing it, and burnout problem solved. There's your pep talk. Now go get to work. It's true that the burnout thing can happen. I've been there myself. I've been teaching for over 35 years now. And there's days where I just like, oh my God, my brain. It's mentally tiring. But then I remember I have probably the coolest job in the world. I get to play guitar and piano and ukulele all day and sing silly songs with kids and help people write music, help people learn music and record music. So I have that all in perspective. But when those hard days happen, I always try and remember how boring some of my music lessons were in school and private lessons, and I change my tone immediately when that happens.